The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Willowbrook Gardens, one of Manhattan's most exclusive residential complexes, when 10-year-old Amelia Matthews ran toward the playground with the innocent excitement that only children possess. She couldn't have known that this ordinary Tuesday would become the catalyst for a transformation that would shake the very foundations of their carefully constructed social hierarchy. What happened next would expose the dark underbelly of privilege, reveal shocking truths about identity, and culminate in a revenge so calculated and devastating that everyone involved would remember this day for the rest of their lives. If you think you've heard dramatic stories before, you haven't seen anything yet. This tale has twists that will leave you breathless, and an ending so incredible you won't believe it's real. Don't miss a thing. Subscribe now and discover the ending of this and other thrilling and dramatic stories. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. From her modest ground-floor apartment, Charlotte Matthews watched her daughter through the window, her heart swelling with the bittersweet pride that had become her constant companion since her husband's death 3 years ago. She had sold everything, their sprawling house in Connecticut, the vacation home in the Hamptons, even her jewelry, to afford this small sanctuary in Manhattan where Amelia could grow up surrounded by the best schools and opportunities. To their neighbors, they appeared to be just another struggling single-parent family, scraping by in one of the city's most expensive areas. Charlotte had cultivated this image carefully, dressing in simple clothes from discount stores, driving an old Honda Civic that she kept deliberately worn-looking, and maintaining the facade of a woman barely making ends meet. But appearances, as the residents of Willowbrook Gardens would soon discover, could be devastatingly deceiving. Charlotte had built her empire in silence. 3 companies that operated under different names, generating millions in revenue annually. Matthews Technology Solutions had revolutionized data management for Fortune 500 companies. Phoenix Real Estate Development had quietly acquired properties across 5 states. Aurora Investment Consulting managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions. She had learned early in her business career that being underestimated was often the greatest advantage a woman could possess in corporate America. So she had perfected the art of invisibility, conducting board meetings via video calls from her modest living room, while wearing designer blazers above and sweatpants below, her true identity known only to her lawyers, accountants, and a select few trusted associates. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had more wealth than most of her neighbors combined, yet she chose to live as their social inferior. It was a conscious decision, born from her desire to give Amelia a normal childhood, free from the pressures and artificial friendships that came with visible wealth. She had grown up poor herself, clawed her way to success through sheer determination and brilliant strategic thinking, and she wanted her daughter to understand the value of hard work and genuine human connection. Amelia had inherited her mother's intelligence and determination, but also possessed an innocence and optimism that Charlotte fiercely protected. The little girl excelled in school, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had a natural gift for mathematics that amazed her teachers. She was kind to everyone, regardless of their social status or background, a trait that made her both beloved by some and a target for others in their stratified community. As Charlotte watched from her window that fateful afternoon, she saw Amelia approaching the playground where several other children from the complex were already playing. Among them was 7-year-old Isabella Worthington, whose mother, Vanessa Worthington, had appointed herself the unofficial queen of Willowbrook Gardens. The Worthingtons lived in the penthouse suite, drove matching Mercedes-Benz vehicles, and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of their superiority. Vanessa was exactly the kind of person Charlotte had learned to navigate carefully in her business dealings. All surface and no substance, but dangerous in her petty cruelties and social manipulations. Vanessa was holding court near the playground. Equipment, surrounded by several other mothers, who hung on her every word like disciples awaiting wisdom from their prophet. Charlotte had attempted to integrate into this social circle when they first moved in, attending a few coffee mornings and community meetings. But she had quickly realized that these women weren't interested in genuine friendship. They wanted to know your net worth, your husband's profession, your child's acceptance into the right private schools. When Charlotte couldn't provide the expected answers, When she deflected questions about her finances with vague responses about getting by and making it work, she had been smoothly but definitively excluded from their inner circle. The rejection had stung initially, but Charlotte had convinced herself it didn't matter. She had more important things to focus on, like the quarterly reports from her companies, the new acquisition her real estate division was negotiating, or the innovative software patent her technology firm was about to file. She told herself that the opinions of these shallow, privileged women were irrelevant to her life and her daughter's happiness. But as she watched Amelia skip toward the playground that afternoon, Charlotte felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. Children could be cruel, but adults who taught them that cruelty was acceptable were infinitely worse. Amelia reached the playground and waved enthusiastically at the other children. "Hi, everyone. Can I play too?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Charlotte found herself holding her breath as she watched the scene unfold. Isabella Worthington looked up from her elaborate dollhouse, a designer toy that probably cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month, and her expression shifted into something that made Charlotte's blood run cold. It was an adult expression on a child's face, learned and practiced, full of calculated disdain. "My mommy says we shouldn't play with poor people," Isabella announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She says they might be dirty or have diseases." The other children giggled uncertainly, caught between their natural inclination to include everyone and their learned deference to social hierarchy. Amelia's face flushed with embarrassment, but she maintained her cheerful demeanor with the resilience that never failed to amaze her mother. "I'm not dirty," Amelia said quietly. "I take a bath every night, and my mom says cleanliness comes from taking care of yourself, not from how much money you have." This response seemed to infuriate Isabella, who clearly wasn't used to being contradicted. She stood up, brushing imaginary dust from her designer dress, and walked over to where Amelia stood. The other children formed a circle around them, sensing drama but not understanding the adult complexities at play. "Look at your shoes," Isabella said, pointing at Amelia's simple sneakers. "They're from Walmart. My shoes. Cost more than your entire outfit. My mommy says people like you are beggars who don't belong in nice places like this." Charlotte's hands clenched into fists as she watched her daughter's face crumple momentarily before she gathered herself with incredible dignity. Amelia looked down at her shoes, clean, practical, perfectly adequate sneakers that Charlotte had chosen specifically because they were comfortable and durable. There was nothing wrong with them except that they didn't carry a luxury brand name. "These shoes are fine," Amelia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They help me run fast and jump high. Isn't that what matters?" But Isabella wasn't finished. She had learned cruelty from a master, and she wielded it with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "No, what matters is that you don't belong here. This playground is for kids whose parents can actually afford to live here, not for people who probably can't even pay their rent." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Charlotte watched her daughter's shoulders sag as the weight of the humiliation settled over her like a heavy blanket. But it was what happened next that truly broke her heart. Vanessa Worthington approached the group of children, having observed the interaction from her position nearby. Charlotte expected, hoped, that she would intervene, tell her daughter that such behavior was unacceptable, perhaps even offer an apology for Isabella's cruel words. Instead, Vanessa smiled approvingly at her daughter before turning her attention to Amelia. "Isabella, darling, you're absolutely right," Vanessa said, her voice carrying clearly across the playground. "We should be more careful about who we allow our children to associate with. Social standards exist for a reason." Charlotte felt the world tilt on its axis. She had endured countless professional challenges, navigated hostile business environments, faced down corporate bullies who tried to intimidate her because of her gender. But watching a grown woman publicly humiliate her 10-year-old daughter was a different kind of pain entirely. It was the kind of hurt that cut straight through every defense she had built, every rational thought she could muster, every attempt at adult perspective. Vanessa continued her verbal assault with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced real consequences for her actions. "Amelia, sweetie, perhaps you'd be more comfortable playing with children from your own Background. I'm sure there are public playgrounds nearby where you might find friends who are more suitable. The playground fell silent, except for the distant sounds of city traffic. Even the other children seemed to sense that something terrible was happening, something beyond the usual childhood disagreements and hurt feelings. Amelia stood frozen in the center of their circle, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks as the full impact of the rejection hit her. I just wanted to play, Amelia whispered, her voice so broken that Charlotte had to grip the windowsill to keep from running outside immediately. I understand, dear, Vanessa replied with false sympathy. But sometimes we have to accept our limitations. Your mother should have explained this to you, before allowing you to embarrass yourself this way. That final comment, the suggestion that Charlotte had failed as a parent, that she had somehow set her daughter up for this humiliation, pushed her past her breaking point. But even as rage consumed her, a cold, calculating part of her mind was already working, already planning, already seeing the chess moves that would lead to Vanessa Worthington's complete and utter destruction. Charlotte forced herself to remain at the window, forced herself to watch as her daughter walked slowly away from the playground, her small shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. She forced herself to memorize every detail of Vanessa's satisfied smile, every laugh from the other mothers who had witnessed the scene with obvious approval. She forced herself to burn this moment into her memory so thoroughly that she would never forget why what came next was not just justified, but necessary. When Amelia finally reached their apartment door, Charlotte was waiting with open arms and a box of tissues. She held her daughter close, stroking her hair and whispering reassurances while her brilliant mind worked through the implications of what she had just witnessed. This wasn't just about playground politics or childhood conflicts. This was about systematic cruelty, about adults who had chosen to make a 10-year-old child pay for their own insecurities and prejudices. "Mommy," Amelia sobbed against her shoulder. "Why don't they like me? I try to be nice to everyone. I share my toys and help with homework and never say mean things. Why isn't that enough?" Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling her daughter's pain as if it were her own. In that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. She had spent 3 years playing a role, maintaining a facade, protecting her family by hiding in plain sight. But some things were more important than anonymity. Some battles were worth revealing yourself to fight. "Sometimes, baby," Charlotte said softly, "people are mean because they're scared or insecure, or because no one ever taught them how to be kind. But that doesn't make it okay, and it doesn't mean you have to accept it." Already subscribed? Leave a like and tell us where you're watching from. We want to know where our audience comes from. As night fell over Manhattan, Charlotte sat in her home office, the one room in the apartment that reflected her true life, filled with multiple monitors, secure communication equipment, and the tools of modern business warfare. She had tucked Amelia into bed an hour ago, reading her favorite story twice, and promising that tomorrow would be better. Now it was time to make sure that promise came. True. Her first call was to Marcus Feldman, her head of legal affairs, and one of the most feared corporate attorneys in New York. Marcus had been her friend since law school, the only person who knew the full extent of her business empire, and the only one who understood why she chose to live the way she did. "Charlotte?" Marcus's voice was immediately alert, despite the late hour. "What's wrong?" "I need you to pull everything you can find on Vanessa Worthington and her husband Richard," Charlotte said, her voice steady and cold. "Financial records, property holdings, business dealings, legal troubles, personal history, everything. That's a pretty standard background check. What's the urgency?" Charlotte closed her eyes, seeing again her daughter's devastated face. "Someone made a mistake today, Marcus. A very big mistake. And I'm going to show them exactly how big it was." Marcus had known Charlotte long enough to recognize the tone in her voice. He had seen her destroy corporate rivals with surgical precision, dismantling their companies piece by piece through perfectly legal but devastatingly effective business strategies. When Charlotte Matthews decided you were her enemy, your defeat wasn't a matter of if, but when. "I'll have a preliminary report by morning," Marcus promised. And Charlotte? Whatever they did, they're about to learn why people underestimate you at their own peril. Her second call was to Sarah Chen, president of Phoenix Real Estate Development. Sarah had built her reputation, finding and acquiring properties that others considered impossible to obtain, using a combination of financial leverage, market expertise, and sheer determination that made her invaluable to Charlotte's empire. Sarah, I need you to look into the Worthington penthouse at Willowbrook Gardens, Charlotte said without preamble. I want to know everything about their financial situation, their mortgage status, any liens or encumbrances on the property. Willowbrook Gardens? Sarah sounded surprised. Isn't that where you live? Yes, and tomorrow, I want to know exactly how much it would cost to own it. The third call was to David Morrison, CEO of Aurora Investment Consulting. David managed her portfolio with the kind of aggressive intelligence that had turned her initial inheritance from her grandmother into a financial empire worth hundreds of millions. He was also completely ruthless when it came to identifying and exploiting weaknesses in financial structures. David, I need you to research Richard Worthington's business ventures, Charlotte said. I want to know about his investments, his cash flow, any vulnerabilities in his financial position. And I need it fast. This sounds personal, David observed. It is. Someone hurt my daughter today, David, and I'm going to make sure it never happens again. By 3 a.m, Charlotte had laid the groundwork for what would become the most satisfying business campaign of her career. She had requests out to private investigators, financial analysts, and legal researchers. She had activated a network of professionals who had helped her build her empire, and who understood that when Charlotte Matthews asked for something, it was because someone had made the fatal error of underestimating her. But it wasn't enough just to destroy Vanessa Worthington's life, though Charlotte fully intended to do that. She needed to do it in a way that would serve as a lesson, not just for Vanessa, but for every other privileged bully who thought they could humiliate innocent children without consequences. She needed to make this public, dramatic, and unforgettable. As the sun rose over Manhattan, Charlotte was already dressed and preparing breakfast for Amelia, who emerged from her bedroom looking subdued but determined. Charlotte's heart ached as she watched her daughter carefully arrange her appearance, choosing her clothes with obvious deliberation, braiding her hair with extra care. Amelia was preparing to face her tormentors again, and the courage it took for a 10-year-old to do that made Charlotte's resolve even stronger. How are you feeling this morning, sweetheart? Charlotte asked gently. Better, Amelia replied, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I've been thinking about what you said last night, about how some people are mean because they're scared. I think Mrs. Worthington might be scared that if she's nice to everyone, people won't think she's special anymore. Charlotte paused in her preparation of Amelia's lunch, struck by her daughter's insight. Even after being humiliated and rejected, Amelia was trying to understand her tormentors rather than hate them. It was a generosity of spirit that Charlotte both admired and wanted to protect at all costs. You're very wise, baby, Charlotte said. But you know what? Sometimes understanding why someone is mean isn't enough. Sometimes we have to show them that their behavior has consequences. That afternoon, as Charlotte walked Amelia to the playground for what would be their last day of hiding behind a facade, her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Report ready. This is going to be interesting. The legal and financial information her team had compiled painted a picture of the Worthingtons that was both fascinating and deeply satisfying. Richard Worthington's business empire, which appeared so solid from the outside, was actually a house of cards built on a leveraged debt and creative accounting. His commercial real estate company was hemorrhaging money, propped up only by a series of increasingly desperate loans secured against personal assets. The penthouse apartment that served as the symbol of their superiority was mortgaged to the hilt, with payments that were consuming nearly 70% of their monthly income. More interesting still was the information about Vanessa herself. Before marrying Richard, she had been Vanessa Kowalski from Queens, daughter of a plumber and a school cafeteria worker. She had married into money and spent the subsequent 15 years desperately trying to erase every trace of her working-class background. Her cruelty toward Charlotte and Amelia wasn't just snobbery. It was the overcompensation of someone who lived in constant fear that others would see through her carefully constructed facade. The irony was delicious. Here was a woman who had built her entire identity around looking down on people she perceived as beneath her, when in reality, Charlotte could buy and sell everything the Worthingtons owned without even making a dent in her personal accounts. As they approached the playground, Charlotte saw Vanessa holding court in her usual spot, surrounded by her usual admirers. Isabella was playing nearby, directing the other children with the imperious authority of someone who had never been told that her opinions weren't the center of the universe. Several other parents were scattered around the area, and Charlotte realized this was perfect. She would have an audience for what came next. But first, she wanted to give Vanessa one final opportunity to reveal her true character. "Amelia," Charlotte said quietly, "I want you to go play with whichever children seem friendly to you. If anyone says something mean, just walk away and come find me, okay?" Amelia nodded and ran toward the swings, where 2 other children were playing a game that looked welcoming and fun. Charlotte watched as her daughter joined in, her natural enthusiasm quickly overcoming the hesitation from yesterday's humiliation. For a few minutes, it seemed like everything might be normal. Then Isabella Worthington noticed Amelia's presence. "Mommy," Isabella called loudly, her voice carrying across the playground. "The poor girl is back. I thought you told her she wasn't supposed to play here." Vanessa looked up from her conversation, her expression immediately shifting to one of annoyed disdain. She stood up, smoothing her designer dress, and walked over to where Amelia was playing. Charlotte followed at a distance, close enough to intervene if necessary, far enough to let the scene play out naturally. "Amelia," Vanessa said in a voice that dripped with false sweetness, "I thought we had discussed this yesterday. This playground is really intended for families who belong to our community association. Perhaps you could find somewhere more appropriate to spend your time." Charlotte felt her jaw clench as she watched her daughter's face fall. But Amelia, with the resilience that had carried her through 3 years of their carefully maintained deception, lifted her chin and looked directly at Vanessa. "My mom pays rent here just like everyone else," Amelia said quietly but clearly. "That means I belong here too." Vanessa's laugh was sharp and unpleasant. "Oh, sweetheart, there's so much you don't understand about how the world works. Just because someone manages to scrape together enough money to rent a small apartment doesn't mean they belong in the same social circles as people who own substantial properties and contribute meaningfully to society." The condescension in her voice was like fingernails on a chalkboard. But Charlotte forced herself to remain still. She needed to hear everything, needed to let Vanessa reveal the full extent of her cruelty before she responded. "My mom contributes to society," Amelia said, her voice growing stronger. "She helps people with computers, and she's really smart and she works really hard." "I'm sure she tries," Vanessa replied, with patronizing sympathy. "But darling, there's a difference between having a little job and actually building something meaningful. Your mother is, well, she's doing her best with limited resources. But that doesn't entitle you to impose yourself on families who've worked hard to create a certain standard of living. Just one click. Subscribe, leave a like, and say where you're, watching from. Your support is essential for our growth." That was it. Charlotte had heard enough. She stepped forward, her posture shifting from the slightly hunched, apologetic stance she had cultivated over 3 years to the commanding presence that had intimidated CEOs and venture capitalists across 3 continents. "Mrs. Worthington," Charlotte said, her voice carrying clearly across the playground, "I believe you've said quite enough." Vanessa turned, clearly expecting to face the same meek, financially struggling single mother she had been tormenting. Instead, she found herself looking at a woman whose entire demeanor radiated power, confidence, and barely contained fury. For the first time, Charlotte let her true self show. The self that had built a business empire through sheer intelligence and determination. The self that had earned respect and fear in equal measure from some of the most powerful people in America. "Oh," Vanessa said, slightly taken aback by the change in Charlotte's presence but still confident in her social superiority. "I was just explaining to your daughter that children need to learn about social boundaries. It's really a kindness, helping her understand her place in the world. Her place in the world, Charlotte repeated slowly, savoring each word. That's an interesting phrase, Mrs. Worthington. Tell me, what exactly do you think her place is? Vanessa's smile became more strained as she sensed something shifting in the dynamic, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. Well, I simply think children should play with others from similar backgrounds. It prevents misunderstandings and hurt feelings. Similar backgrounds, Charlotte mused. Like yours, for instance? Exactly. Isabella comes from a family with substantial means, excellent connections, and a strong understanding of social expectations. We've worked very hard to provide her with advantages that will serve her throughout her life. Charlotte nodded, thoughtfully, as if considering this perspective seriously. Around them, other parents had begun to notice the conversation, drawn by something in Charlotte's tone that suggested this was going to be more than a typical playground disagreement. You know, Mrs. Worthington, you're absolutely right about the importance of understanding backgrounds, Charlotte said. For instance, I've recently learned quite a bit about yours. Vanessa's confident smile faltered slightly. I'm not sure what you mean. Vanessa Kowalski from Queens, Charlotte said conversationally, daughter of Stanley Kowalski, who worked as a plumber for the city water department for 37 years, and Margaret Kowalski, who served lunch to children at PS 142 for 23 years before retiring. Both hardworking, honest people who would probably be horrified to see how their daughter treats children whose parents work for a living. The color drained from Vanessa's face as she realized that her carefully constructed past had been exposed. Around them, the other parents exchanged glances, some shocked, others clearly recognizing the hypocrisy of someone from a working-class background, attacking another parent for supposedly being beneath their social status. How dare you investigate my private life? Vanessa stammered, her practiced social facade cracking. Oh, I haven't even started yet, Charlotte replied with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Would you like to discuss your husband's business ventures? Because I have to say, the financial picture is quite fascinating. Vanessa's face went from pale to green as she realized that Charlotte wasn't just some struggling single mother who could be dismissed and forgotten. This was someone with resources, connections, and the clear intention to use them. Richard's business affairs are none of your concern, Vanessa said, but her voice lacked conviction. Actually, they became my concern the moment you decided to humiliate my daughter in public, Charlotte replied. You see, Mrs. Worthington, I have a policy about people who hurt my family. I make it my business to understand exactly who they are and what makes them vulnerable. The playground had gone completely quiet now. Even the children had stopped playing, sensing the adult drama unfolding around them. Charlotte could see several parents filming with their phones. Perfect. She wanted this to be documented, shared, remembered. I think perhaps we should discuss this privately, Vanessa said, clearly desperate to get away from the growing audience. Oh no, Charlotte said firmly. You chose to humiliate a child in public. The response needs to be equally public. You want to talk about social standards and appropriate behavior? Let's talk about adults who bully children. Let's talk about women who have forgotten where they came from and think that cruelty is a sign of sophistication. Vanessa looked around desperately, seeking support from her usual circle of admirers, but found only uncomfortable faces and averted eyes. The other parents were beginning to realize that they were witnessing the complete dismantling of someone they had considered their social superior, and none of them wanted to be associated with what was clearly going to be a spectacular fall from grace. Furthermore, Charlotte continued, her voice growing stronger and more commanding, I think it's time everyone here knew exactly what kind of person they've been taking social cues from. Richard Worthington's company is 3 months behind on loan payments. The penthouse apartment you're so proud of? It's leveraged beyond its value, and the bank is already making inquiries about foreclosure proceedings. Vanessa's gasp was audible across the playground. You can't know that. That's confidential financial information. I know it because I make it my business to know things about people who threaten my family, Charlotte replied. I also know that your husband's commercial properties are hemorrhaging money, that your joint credit card debt exceeds $40,000, and that you've been using cash advances to make your mortgage payments for the last 6 months. The assembled parents were staring now, some with obvious fascination, others with barely concealed glee at seeing the neighborhood's self-appointed queen brought low. Vanessa stood frozen in the center of their attention, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. But Charlotte wasn't finished. "You want to talk about people who don't belong here, Mrs. Worthington? Let's talk about people who are living beyond their means, building their entire identity around possessions they can't afford, and teaching their children that cruelty is acceptable as long as you're punching down at people you think can't fight back." "Stop," Vanessa whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," Charlotte said firmly. "You didn't stop when a 10-year-old girl asked you to. You didn't stop when you saw her crying. You didn't stop when every decent instinct should have told you that what you were doing was wrong. So I'm not going to stop now." She pulled out her phone and made a call that everyone present could hear clearly. "Sarah? Yes, it's Charlotte. I want you to make an offer on the Worthington penthouse. Full asking price, cash, closing in 30 days. And make sure the offer goes through Richard's mortgage company. I want them to know that someone is prepared to pay off their debt immediately." Vanessa's legs seemed to give out, and she sank onto a nearby bench, staring at Charlotte in shock and growing horror. "David?" Charlotte's second call was equally public. "I want you to look into acquiring the debt on Richard Worthington's commercial properties. I'm not interested in running them. I want to own the paper and then foreclose. Yes, I know it's not our usual strategy, but this is personal." By now, several parents were openly recording the conversation, and Charlotte could see that at least 2 were broadcasting live on social media. Perfect. She wanted this to spread, wanted it to become a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating people. "Mrs. Matthews," one of the other mothers said tentatively, "are you saying that you're going to buy the Worthingtons' apartment?" Charlotte turned to face the woman, Patricia Hamilton, if she remembered correctly, whose husband worked in middle management at a financial services firm. Patricia had been one of Vanessa's most devoted followers, hanging on her every word and eagerly participating in the casual cruelties that passed for social bonding in their circle. "I'm saying that I'm going to buy everything they think they own," Charlotte replied calmly. "The apartment, the commercial properties, the lifestyle they've built on borrowed money and borrowed time. And then I'm going to make sure that everyone understands that actions have consequences." She walked over to where Amelia was standing with the other children, all of whom were staring at their parents with the confused fascination of children watching the adult world reveal its hidden complexities. "Amelia, sweetheart," Charlotte said gently, "I want you to remember this moment, not because of the mean things that were said to you, but because of what happened next. When someone tries to hurt you because they think you can't fight back, when they mistake kindness for weakness or humility for powerlessness, that's when you show them who you really are." Amelia nodded solemnly, and Charlotte could see in her daughter's eyes a new understanding of the world's complexities, but also a growing confidence in her own worth and her mother's ability to protect her. Charlotte turned back to address the group of parents, all of whom were now staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to fear. "For those of you who don't know me," she said, her voice carrying easily across the playground, "my name is Charlotte Matthews. I own Matthews Technology Solutions, Phoenix Real Estate Development, and Aurora Investment Consulting. My companies generate approximately $200 million in annual revenue. I choose to live modestly because I believe in teaching my daughter the value of hard work and genuine human connection." The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the sound of car engines from the street and the distant hum of city life. Several parents had their phones out, frantically searching for information about Charlotte's companies, their faces showing growing amazement as they confirmed what she had just told them. "I've spent 3 years in this community being dismissed, overlooked, and condescended to by people who assumed that modest living meant modest means," Charlotte continued. "I've watched my daughter be excluded from birthday parties, ignored by children whose parents taught them that social hierarchy was more important than kindness, and treated as invisible by adults who never bothered to look beyond surface appearances. She paused, looking directly at each parent in turn, making sure they understood that she was addressing all of them, not just Vanessa. But yesterday, someone crossed a line. Yesterday, a grown woman chose to publicly humiliate a child, not because that child had done anything wrong, but because she wanted to reinforce a social order that made her feel superior. That was a mistake, a very expensive mistake. Vanessa finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mrs. Matthews, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I apologize for what I said to Amelia. Please, can't we work this out?" Charlotte studied Vanessa's face, seeing in it the dawning realization of what was about to happen to her life, the fear, the desperation, the sudden understanding that the woman she had dismissed as powerless was actually capable of destroying everything she had built. "Mrs. Worthington," Charlotte said quietly, "do you know what the difference is between us? It's not money. It's not social connections. It's not education or opportunity, or any of the things you've been using to justify your cruelty." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a level that only Vanessa could hear clearly. "The difference is that I earned everything I have through my own intelligence and hard work, while you've spent 15 years pretending to be something you're not. The difference is that when I had power over someone who couldn't fight back, I used it to protect them. When you had that same power, you used it to hurt them. That's why you deserve everything that's about to happen to you." Charlotte stepped back so that her voice would carry to everyone present. "The offer on your apartment will be formal by tomorrow morning. The foreclosure proceedings on your husband's properties will begin within the week. And everyone in this community now knows exactly what kind of person you really are." She turned to address the other parents one final time. "I want to be clear about something. I'm not doing this out of spite or revenge. I'm doing it to send a message. The message is simple. If you choose to be cruel to children, if you choose to build your self-worth by tearing down others, if you choose to mistake someone's kindness for weakness, there will be consequences. Not someday, not eventually. Immediately and completely." Charlotte took Amelia's hand and started walking toward their apartment, but paused after a few steps. "Oh, and Mrs. Worthington, you might want to start looking for a new place to live. I'm thinking of turning the penthouse into a community center for underprivileged children, somewhere they can play without worrying about whether their shoes are expensive enough." As they walked away, Charlotte could hear the explosion of conversation behind them as the assembled parents processed what they had just witnessed. She could imagine the phone calls that would be made that evening, the social media posts, the way this story would spread through their community and beyond. But more importantly, she could feel Amelia's hand in hers, no longer trembling with hurt and confusion, but strong and confident. "Mommy," Amelia said as they reached their front door, "are you really going to buy Mrs. Worthington's apartment?" "Yes, sweetheart, I am." "And turn it into a place for kids to play?" "That's the plan." Amelia was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then she looked up at her mother with eyes that held a new understanding of the world's complexities. "She was really mean to me," Amelia said finally. "Yes, she was. But you were meaner to her." Charlotte paused, considering how to answer this. She wanted to be honest with her daughter, but she also wanted to make sure Amelia understood the difference between necessary consequences and unnecessary cruelty. "Sometimes, baby, the only way to stop a bully is to show them that picking on people has consequences. Mrs. Worthington hurt you because she thought no one would stop her. She was wrong. Are you going to make her homeless?" The question was asked with the directness that only children possessed, cutting straight to the heart of the moral complexity involved. Charlotte knelt down so she could look directly into her daughter's eyes. "I'm going to make sure she understands that actions have consequences," Charlotte said carefully. "But I'm also going to make sure that she and her family have opportunities to learn from this and do better. Sometimes people need to lose everything before they can find out who they really are underneath all the pretending." That evening, as Charlotte tucked Amelia into bed, Her daughter asked one final question that stopped her in her tracks. "Mommy, if you're really rich, why do we live like we don't have money?" Charlotte sat down on the edge of the bed, realizing that their 3-year experiment in modest living was officially over. Tomorrow their neighbors would know the truth, and there would be no going back to anonymity. "Because I wanted you to understand that a person's worth isn't measured by what they own or how much money they have," Charlotte said. "I wanted you to learn to be kind to everyone, regardless of whether they could do something for you in return. I wanted you to understand the value of hard work and genuine friendship. Did I learn those things?" Charlotte smiled, thinking about how her daughter had continued to try to include everyone in her play, even after being rejected and humiliated, how she had shown more grace and dignity in the face of cruelty than most adults ever managed. "Yes, baby, you did. And now that you've learned them, we can stop pretending to be something we're not. So tomorrow we can tell people that we're really rich. Tomorrow people are going to figure that out for themselves, and we're going to show them that being wealthy doesn't mean you have to be cruel, and that having power means using it to protect people who need protection." As Charlotte turned off the lights and closed Amelia's door, she felt a sense of completion that had been missing for 3 years. The experiment was over, the facade was dropped, and tomorrow would bring the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. But first, she had work to do. Charlotte spent the next several hours on conference calls with her legal team, her real estate advisors, and her financial consultants. By dawn, she had set in motion a series of actions that would completely reshape the Worthingtons' lives and send shockwaves through their entire social circle. The first domino fell at 9 a.m., when Sarah Chen called Richard Worthington's office with a formal offer to purchase the penthouse apartment. The offer was for full asking price, cash, with a 30-day closing period, and no contingencies. It was the kind of offer that sellers dream about. Except that Richard wasn't planning to sell. He had built his entire identity around that apartment, used it as collateral for multiple loans, and leveraged it to maintain his family's lifestyle. But he also owed more on it than it was worth, and his mortgage company had been making increasingly urgent inquiries about his payment schedule. When they received word that someone was prepared to pay cash immediately, they informed Richard that he could either accept the offer voluntarily or face foreclosure proceedings within 60 days. The second domino fell at 11 a.m., when David Morrison's investment firm made formal offers to purchase the debt on all of Richard's commercial properties. The offers were slightly above market value, which meant the banks holding the paper were eager to sell. By noon, Charlotte owned approximately $12 million worth of Richard Worthington's business debt, which gave her the legal right to call in the loans immediately. The third domino was more subtle, but potentially more devastating to Vanessa's social position. By lunchtime, the video of Charlotte's playground revelation had been shared across multiple social media platforms, garnering thousands of views and hundreds of comments. The story was being picked up by local news outlets, framed as a David and Goliath tale about a wealthy businesswoman defending her daughter against playground bullies. But it was the fourth domino that truly sealed Vanessa's fate in their social circle. Patricia Hamilton, who had been one of Vanessa's most devoted followers, posted a detailed account on the community Facebook page describing how she had watched Vanessa humiliate a child and then get completely demolished by that child's mother, who turned out to be a multimillionaire business owner. Patricia's post included photos from the confrontation, quotes from Charlotte's speech, and her own apology for having enabled Vanessa's behavior through her silence. Within hours, the post had been shared by dozens of community members, each adding their own commentary about times they had witnessed Vanessa's cruelty or felt intimidated by her social power. What emerged was a picture of someone who had systematically bullied and excluded others, using her perceived wealth and status as weapons against anyone she considered beneath her. Charlotte watched this unfold from her home office with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She had wanted consequences for Vanessa's actions, but seeing the complete destruction of someone's social standing was sobering, even when that person deserved it. Her phone rang at 2 p.m. The caller ID showed Richard Worthington's office number. "Mrs. Matthews?" Richard's voice was strained and formal. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I received an offer to purchase my apartment, and I'm told it came from one of your companies. There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Worthington. The offer is genuine. We're not looking to sell. That apartment is our home. Surely we can work something out. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, looking out the window at the playground, where the confrontation had taken place less than 24 hours earlier. Mr. Worthington, your wife chose to publicly humiliate my 10-year-old daughter. She called her a beggar, told her she didn't belong in this community, and suggested that I had failed as a parent by not teaching Amelia to accept her supposed place in the social hierarchy. Did you know about this? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Charlotte wondered if the call had been dropped. Vanessa mentioned there was some sort of playground disagreement, Richard said finally. But children have conflicts all the time. Surely this is an overreaction. An overreaction, Charlotte repeated slowly. Mr. Worthington, let me explain something to you. I built my business empire by understanding exactly how much power I have, and using it judiciously. For 3 years, I've lived in your community without anyone knowing my true financial status. I've watched your wife exclude my daughter from social gatherings, ignore her in group settings, and treat her as invisible because she assumed we were too poor to matter. She paused, letting this sink in. I tolerated all of that because I wanted my daughter to learn important lessons about character and genuine friendship. But yesterday, your wife crossed a line. She chose to be cruel. To a child, not in private, but in front of an audience, with the clear intention of humiliating and excluding her. That wasn't a playground disagreement, Mr. Worthington. That was an adult woman bullying a child. I understand you're upset, Richard said, his voice becoming more desperate. But destroying our lives seems like an extreme response. We have a child, too. Isabella is just 7 years old. How does it help anyone to make her homeless? Charlotte felt a flicker of sympathy for Isabella, who was indeed an innocent victim in this situation. But she also remembered the way Isabella had parroted her mother's cruel words, already learning to exclude and demean others based on perceived social status. Your daughter won't be homeless, Mr. Worthington, but she might learn some valuable lessons about how the other half lives. Lessons that could help her become a better person than her mother. Please, Richard said, and Charlotte could hear genuine desperation in his voice. Now, what do you want? Money? An apology? I'll make sure Vanessa apologizes publicly. I'll pay for counseling for your daughter if she was traumatized. Just please don't destroy our lives over one mistake. One mistake? Charlotte's voice hardened. Mr. Worthington, this wasn't one mistake. This was the culmination of 3 years of systematic exclusion and condescension. This was your wife revealing who she really is when she thinks no one can stop her. And this is me revealing who I really am when someone threatens my family. I don't understand, Richard said weakly. You don't understand because you've spent so long focused on appearances that you've forgotten to pay attention to substance. You married a woman who's been pretending to be something she's not for so long that she's forgotten her own origins. You've built a lifestyle on borrowed money and borrowed time, and you've taught your daughter that cruelty is acceptable as long as you're punching down. Charlotte stood up and walked to her window, looking down at the playground where a few children were playing, while their parents watched nervously. The sale of your apartment will go through whether you cooperate or not, she said calmly. The foreclosure on your commercial properties will proceed as scheduled, and everyone in this community now knows exactly what kind of people you are. Those are the consequences of your choices. But what about Isabella? Richard asked desperately. What about our daughter? Your daughter will learn that actions have consequences. She'll learn that the world is bigger and more complex than she thought. And hopefully, she'll learn to be a better person than her parents. Those might be the most valuable lessons she ever receives. Charlotte hung up the phone and immediately called Marcus Feldman. Marcus, I want you to set up a trust fund for Isabella Worthington. $500,000, managed by independent trustees, accessible for education expenses and basic living needs until she turns 25. That's unexpectedly generous, Marcus observed. I'm not punishing a child for her parents' failures, Charlotte said. But I am making sure she understands that kindness and cruelty both have consequences. Maybe she'll grow up to be someone who chooses kindness. The final confrontation came 3 days later, when Vanessa appeared at Charlotte's door at 7 in the morning, her designer clothes wrinkled, her carefully styled hair disheveled, her makeup streaked with tears. "Please," Vanessa said, as soon as Charlotte opened the door. "Please, I'm begging you. I'll do anything. I'll apologize publicly. I'll pay you. I'll leave the community if you want. Just please don't take our home." Charlotte studied the woman standing in her doorway, seeing in her face the complete breakdown of someone whose entire identity had been built on a foundation of lies and pretense. 3 days ago, Vanessa had been the queen of their social circle, confident in her superiority and casual in her cruelty. Now she was a desperate woman facing the loss of everything she had used to define herself. "Mrs. Worthington," Charlotte said quietly, "what exactly are you apologizing for?" Vanessa's face crumpled as she realized that she was going to have to acknowledge specifically what she had done. "I'm sorry for what I said to Amelia. I was wrong. I was cruel. I let my own insecurities make me hurt a child. And that's unforgivable. And I'm sorry for judging you based on appearances. I'm sorry for assuming that modest living meant you were somehow less than me. I'm sorry for teaching my daughter that social hierarchy matters more than kindness." Charlotte nodded slowly. "That's a good start. But Mrs. Worthington, an apology doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't erase the moment when my daughter stood in that playground crying, while you told her she didn't belong. It doesn't change the 3 years of exclusion and condescension. It doesn't fix the lessons your daughter has already learned about how to treat people. Then what can I do?" Vanessa asked desperately. "What will make this right?" Charlotte looked at this broken woman, remembering her own struggles to build her business empire, the times she had been dismissed or underestimated because of her gender or her background. She thought about the lessons she wanted Amelia to learn about power and responsibility, about justice and mercy. "You can start over," Charlotte said finally. "You can find out who you really are when you strip away all the pretense and materialism. You can teach your daughter that a person's worth comes from their character, not their possessions. And you can spend the rest of your life making sure that no other child ever feels the way you made Amelia feel." "But our home," Vanessa whispered. "Our life here." "Your life here was built on a lie," Charlotte replied firmly. "It was built on exclusion and cruelty and the belief that putting others down would somehow lift you up. That life needed to end." She paused, seeing the complete devastation in Vanessa's face, and felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and pity. "I've set up a trust fund for Isabella," Charlotte said. "It will cover her education and basic needs. I've also arranged for your family to have first priority for a rental apartment in a building my company owns in Queens. The rent will be reasonable, the neighborhood is good, and Isabella will attend schools where she might learn different values than the ones you've been teaching her." Vanessa stared at her in shock. You're helping us?" "I'm giving you a chance to start over and do better," Charlotte corrected. "What you do with that chance is up to you. But understand this. If I ever hear of you treating another child the way you treated mine, if you ever try to rebuild your identity by tearing down others, these consequences will seem mild compared to what happens." Next, 1 month later, Charlotte stood in what had been the Worthingtons' penthouse apartment, now transformed into a bright, cheerful community center. The walls were painted in warm, welcoming colors. The floors were covered with soft play mats, and the rooms were filled with books, games, and art supplies. A sign by the entrance read, "Amelia's Place, where every child belongs." The irony wasn't lost on her that the space where her daughter had been told she didn't belong was now a place specifically designed to welcome children who might otherwise be excluded or overlooked. Amelia was helping to arrange books on the new shelves, her face glowing with pride and excitement. Several other children from the community were there as well, including some who had witnessed the original confrontation at the playground. The atmosphere was completely different from that terrible afternoon, filled with laughter, cooperation, and genuine friendship. "Mommy," Amelia said, running over with a picture book in her hands. "Look, this one is about a girl who seemed ordinary, but turned out to be magical. It reminds me of you." Charlotte laughed, thinking about how their own story had unfolded. Sometimes the most ordinary-looking people are the ones with the most extraordinary stories, baby. As the afternoon wound down, and the other families began to leave, Charlotte found herself standing alone in the main room, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline. She thought about the choices that had led them to this moment. Her decision to live modestly, Vanessa's choice to be cruel, her own response to that cruelty, and the chain of consequences that had followed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Worthington update. Vanessa has enrolled in social work classes at Queens Community College. Says she wants to help kids who are being bullied. Richard's starting over with a small consulting firm, much more sustainable business model. Isabella seems to be adjusting well to her new school." Charlotte smiled, feeling a sense of completion that had been building for weeks. Justice had been served, lessons had been learned, and perhaps most importantly, no other child would suffer what Amelia had suffered at Vanessa's hands. As they prepared to leave their new community center, Amelia tugged on Charlotte's sleeve. "Mommy, do you think Mrs. Worthington learned her lesson?" Charlotte considered the question seriously. "I think she's learning it. Sometimes the most important lessons take a long time to fully understand. Do you think she'll be nicer now?" "I hope so, sweetheart. People can change if they want to badly enough. And if they don't?" Charlotte smiled, thinking about her own journey from a struggling young woman to a successful business owner to someone who had the power to reshape other people's lives with a few phone calls. If they don't, they'll discover that their actions still have consequences. Always. As they walked home through their community, Charlotte noticed that other parents looked at them differently now. Some with obvious respect, others with a hint of wariness, all with the knowledge that appearances could be profoundly deceiving. Children ran up to Amelia with invitations to play, to attend birthday parties, to join study groups. The social dynamics that had excluded them for 3 years had been completely transformed in the space of a single afternoon. But the most important change was in Amelia herself. She walked taller now, spoke with more confidence, and carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who knew she was valued and protected. She had learned that sometimes standing up to bullies required more than just being brave. It required being smart, patient, and powerful enough to make consequences stick. That night, as Charlotte tucked her daughter into bed in their modest apartment, which they would keep, she had decided, because it had become home, Amelia asked one final question. "Mommy, are we the good guys in this story?" Charlotte paused, thinking about the complexity of what they had done. They had destroyed one family's life, even if that family had brought it on themselves. They had used overwhelming financial power to settle a personal score, even if that score needed settling. They had chosen public humiliation as a response to public humiliation, even if it was justified. "I think we're the people who stood up when something was wrong," Charlotte said finally. "I think we're the people who made sure that actions had consequences. Whether that makes us good guys or not, well, that's something you'll have to decide for yourself when you're older. I think we're heroes," Amelia said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "We saved other kids from being hurt like I was hurt." Charlotte kissed her daughter's forehead, thinking about the community center that would open officially next week, about the trust fund that would give Isabella Worthington opportunities her parents' choices had nearly cost her, about the family that was learning hard lessons about humility and genuine worth in a small apartment in Queens. Maybe we are, baby. Maybe we are. As she turned off the lights and closed the door, Charlotte reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. 3 years of hiding. 3 years of watching her daughter be excluded and dismissed. 3 years of biting her tongue while people who had done nothing to earn their positions looked down on her family. And then one afternoon, when everything changed, when the mask came off and the truth was revealed, when consequences finally caught up with choices, the girl who had been called a beggar was now the namesake of a community center designed to welcome all children. The woman who had been dismissed as a struggling single mother was revealed to be one of the most successful business people in the city. The family that had been excluded from social circles was now at the center of a community transformation. And the woman who had chosen cruelty over kindness, who had built her identity on putting others down, who had forgotten her own humble origins in her desperation to seem superior. She was learning, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, what it meant to face real consequences for her actions. Charlotte poured herself a glass of wine and sat in her home office, looking at the financial reports and business documents that represented her true life. Tomorrow she would return to board meetings and strategic planning sessions, to the high-stakes world of corporate decision-making that had built her fortune. But tonight, she was simply a mother who had protected her child and taught an important lesson about the dangers of underestimating people. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but something made her answer. "Hello? Mrs. Matthews?" The voice was small, young, uncertain. "This is Isabella. Isabella Worthington." Charlotte's breath caught. She had expected many possible consequences from her actions, but a phone call from the 7-year-old daughter of the woman whose life she had dismantled was not one of them. "Hello, Isabella. How did you get my number?" "I asked my daddy. He said you're the reason we have to move away, but also the reason I can still go to college someday." Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility for this child's future. "What can I do for you, Isabella? I wanted to say I'm sorry for being mean to Amelia, for saying those things. My mommy told me that what we did was really, really wrong, and that you had every right to be angry." The maturity in the child's voice was heartbreaking. At 7 years old, Isabella was grappling with concepts that many adults never fully understood: the relationship between actions and consequences, the difference between justified and unjustified cruelty, the complexity of moral choices in difficult situations. "Thank you for calling, Isabella. That took a lot of courage. Are you still angry at us?" Charlotte thought about how to answer this question honestly without burdening a child with adult complexities. "I was never angry at you, Isabella. You're a little girl who was learning from the adults around you. I was angry at the adults who taught you that it was okay to be mean to other children. My mommy cries a lot now," Isabella said quietly. "She says she forgot how to be a good person, and now she has to remember again. Sometimes forgetting and remembering again makes us stronger than we were before," Charlotte said gently. "Your mommy is learning important lessons. That's not always easy, but it's always worthwhile. Will Amelia forgive me?" The question was asked with the desperate hope of childhood, the belief that all wounds could be healed with the right words or actions. Charlotte looked toward Amelia's room, thinking about her daughter's generous spirit and natural inclination to forgive. "Why don't you ask her yourself? I think she'd like to hear from you." After Isabella hung up, promising to call Amelia the next day, Charlotte sat in the quiet of her apartment, processing the strange turns this story had taken. She had set out to teach a lesson about consequences, and ended up orchestrating a complex drama of justice, mercy, and redemption that would ripple through multiple lives for years to come. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen. "Community center inspection complete. Ready for opening next week. The kids are going to love it." Charlotte smiled, thinking about all the children who would benefit from the space that had been created from the ashes of one family's hubris and cruelty. Amelia's place would be a lasting reminder that every child deserved to belong somewhere, that kindness was more valuable than designer shoes, and that sometimes justice required both punishment and opportunity. As she prepared for bed, Charlotte realized that their story was far from over. It was really just beginning. They had emerged from their 3 years of hiding, revealed their true circumstances, and taken their place in a community that now understood them differently. But more importantly, they had learned and taught lessons about character, consequences, and the power that came from being underestimated. The woman who had called her daughter a beggar now knew the truth, that beggars don't buy penthouses and turn them into community centers. The neighbors who had dismissed them now understood that appearances could be profoundly deceiving, and the little girl who had been told she didn't belong anywhere now had a place named after her, where belonging was the only requirement for entry. It was, Charlotte thought, as she turned off the lights, a very satisfactory ending to a story that had begun with tears and cruel words in a playground. But like all the best stories, it was also the beginning of something new, something built on truth instead of pretense, on inclusion instead of exclusion, on the radical idea that everyone deserved respect, regardless of their apparent circumstances. And tomorrow, when Amelia's place opened its doors for the first time, when children who might otherwise be excluded found a place where they belonged, when the community gathered to celebrate what had been built from the ruins of someone else's cruelty, they would all understand that sometimes the most important victories were won, not through violence or revenge, but through the patient application of consequences and the generous offering of second chances. The neighbor had called her daughter a beggar, and in response, Charlotte had shown them all who she really was, not just a successful businesswoman, but someone who understood that true power came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. It was a lesson written in brick and mortar, in trust funds and second chances, in the transformation of a penthouse into a place where every child could belong. And as the city slept around them, Charlotte Matthews smiled, knowing that justice had been served, lessons had been learned, and tomorrow would bring new opportunities to build something better from the ashes of what had come before.